So welcome to chapter 2. We're going to talk about the nature and extent of crime in this intro to criminal justice course. And we want to go ahead and jump right in. It's very important to understand and know that, as I shared in chapter 1, crime does affect all of us. It is something that happens around us. It is something that is a part of our everyday life. The belief here, and this is something I used to teach about and talk about in victimology, is that anyone can become just another victim, but you also, you're the only person responsible for preventing your own victimization. So with that being said, let's jump in and look at the nature and extent of crime. So let's talk about why and how is crime measured. Now, there are some important benefits to measuring crime. If we can measure crime, we can understand and know the extent and nature of crime. We could evaluate the benefits of policy. In other words, the individuals who are responsible for establishing policy on dealing with crime and looking at crime and tackling crime. We can hopefully identify those groups that are suffering disproportionate amounts of victimization. Remember, the victim is often missed and overlooked on the roadmap to the criminal justice system, but we do want to pause and certainly understand and focus on who are those groups that are potentially victimized. We can also provide targeted assistance. In other words, if we know where crime is occurring, we know how crime is occurring, we could utilize resources to tackle crime. We'll get more into that in the coming chapters when we start breaking down the 3 different components of the criminal justice system. And if you have not been following along, remember, those 3 primary components of the criminal justice system include law enforcement, the courts, and corrections. And then lastly, we can find out where crime is occurring. So when it comes to measuring the extent and nature of crime, we have 2 methods that are primarily used. One, we can gather data. We can gather data through official law enforcement records. And think about when there's a police report. Think about when someone files a complaint that they have been wronged or victimized. But the second method, which to me I really enjoy and I love, and I talk a lot about this in victimology, is that we can just ask people, have they been victims of a crime? You can gather more information just talking to random people on the street, talking to your peers, your coworkers, your friends, your colleagues, whomever, and just asking them, have you been victimized? Have you experienced a crime? Because a lot of times, and again, this is not for this course, but in other courses, people are apprehensive to call the police. So yes, we know official law enforcement records and official law enforcement data is helpful, but generally speaking, if you just go talk to people, you just engage and have a conversation with someone, they'll be more likely than not, to share their experiences on whether they've been victimized or experienced a crime or what has occurred in their life. So when we look at how we gather data, generally speaking, it is done on the government level. And so we have, when it comes to law enforcement records, the FBI, the FBI will handle something called the Uniform Crime Reports, but there's other measures that are used, such as the Supplemental Homicide Report, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and we'll get to this in just a moment. But then also, when it comes to asking people if they've been victims of a crime, then we have the second option, which is the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the BJS, and they are responsible for the National Crime Victimization Survey. And again, if anybody out here that's watching this lecture video, if you've taken victimology, certainly if you've taken me for victimology, you will know what I'm talking about. Even if you've taken me for theories, this will all make perfect sense. But for my people that are in intro, that are just learning about the criminal justice system, just on a surface level, I do want to share how we measure our data, where we get those metric points from, and in all aspects, they come from the government level, whether it's official police reports and police records, the FBI, and we'll get into this in a moment, or if we're asking people, have they been victimized, utilizing the National Crime Victimization Survey. So again, we have the 2 primary ways on how crime is measured. Once again, when we look at the official law enforcement records, as you see right here, we have three options, right? We have the Uniform Crime Reports. This is the program that the FBI uses to compile national crime data. Any law enforcement agency that affects an arrest, and we'll talk about affecting an arrest and all that in the coming chapters, that data will go to the FBI. Then we have the supplementary homicide reports. It supplements the UCR data, but it gives additional details on homicides. I don't really talk about the SHR too much, but it is a great tool when trying to break down and understand homicides that occur in the country. And then lastly, we have the National Incident-Based Reporting System, the NIBRS. It's a very complex national data collection system, and it gathers incident-based crime info from law enforcement. We will talk a little bit about the NIBRS in just a moment. Of course, we know our second metric we can use is asking citizens if they have been victimized, and that's basically by conducting a survey. We'll utilize that through the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, and that NCVS is, again, as I previously pointed out, it's conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the BJS. And all we're going to do is we're going to talk to people, hope they'll be open and honest about their victimization. And, in a second, we'll talk a little bit more about the benefit of this survey as well. So when we look at the FBI's measurement on crime, the Uniform Crime Report, it's going to collect from about 17,000 law enforcement agencies. That's the approximate number of law enforcement agencies in the country. Essentially, every law enforcement agency is going to supply data to the FBI under the Uniform Crime Report. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you is that there's Part 1 and Part 2 crimes. Your Part 1 crimes are your common and serious crimes. Think about Part 1 crimes being very violent crimes. It could be battery, or aggravated battery. It could be, some sexually based crimes. It could be arson. It could be very serious crimes. Think about like serious felonies. Your Part 2 crimes are less common and less serious. Generally speaking, they may be misdemeanors. It could be vandalism. It could be minor offenses. Once again, for my people taking intro, we will talk about the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor, so don't worry. But your Part 1 crimes are your very serious crimes. Your Part 2 crimes are your less serious crimes. Now, the supplementary homicide reports, the SHR, again, I've never really talked about the SHR in any course. And it may be something I may dive into a little bit further in future semesters, especially in a course like victimology per se. But the key with the supplementary homicide report is that it does provide those detailed information on homicides. When we are looking at a homicide, and we'll, in other courses, we really break down and talk about what a homicide is. Generally speaking, from a law enforcement perspective, from a data perspective, homicides are mostly not really talked about. There's data that is kept on the number of homicides that occur throughout the country, certainly the cities with the highest homicide rates per se, but generally speaking, there's not a whole lot that's often talked about in criminology and criminal justice circles when it comes to homicide data. So the supplementary homicide report is helpful. It's just not looked at as often, but it is a valuable tool when trying to capture those circumstances that led up to the homicide. Now, we also have the National Incident-Based Reporting System, the NIBRS. What the NIBRS does is it does cover more crimes, and it establishes this thing called the hierarchy rule. Now, again, I'm not trying to get into great detail because this is an intro course. This is an opportunity for me to offer some knowledge and offer some, early, this is an opportunity for me to offer some knowledge and some, early information on how data is captured and how data is reported. So we're not going to really talk about this hierarchy rule. We save that for another class that I have. But what I do want to point to you is that there are some issues. For example, the biggest issue, folks, is that the NIBRS only collects data from about 7,238 law enforcement agencies. Now, I just shared with you all there's over 17,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, give or take, right? If we have 17,000 law enforcement agencies that are providing data to the Uniform Crime Reports, the UCR, to the FBI, why are only not even half? We're talking about, yes, give or take 43% of law enforcement agencies are providing data to the NIBRS. That's a bit of a problem, but again, we'll go over that in a different class. Now, again, looking at the NIBRS, one thing that is noteworthy is whereas the Uniform Crime Reports have Part 1 and Part 2 crimes, the NIBRS has Group A and Group B categories, and as you can see how they break down. When you look at your Group A, folks, Group A, all very serious charges. Arson, burglary, human trafficking, homicide, those are very, very serious charges. Your Group B offenses are very minor charges. Trespass, driving under the influence, although driving under the influence can be bad. Don't drink and drive. If you weren't in the last class, you might want to go back and look. What's the legal limit? 0.08. But with that being said, as you can see, the Group B offenses are not as serious compared to your Group A offenses. And this is with the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or the NIBRS. Now, we want to move along. If we know that we can capture data through official police records, law enforcement arrests, through the supplementary homicide reports or the NIBRS, we still have to talk about how people provide data when they don't want to report crime to the police. And so with that being said, we get the National Crime Panel, right? The National Crime Panel was commissioned by LBJ, President LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965, which wanted to look at the causes and characteristics of crime. And what the president's National Crime Panel found was that even though we have the Uniform Crime Report, not everybody is reporting crime to police. In fact, there you have right here, this dark figure of crime. It's crime unknown to the police. And so with that being said, and understanding that there's this dark figure of crime, we need a tool. We need to have a tool to capture the data that is missing. And the greatest tool we have is the National Crime Panel, which became the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is still in existence even today. So we're talking nearly 60 years later, 60 plus years later, give or take. We still have the National Crime, Victimization Survey. 60, 70 years later, we still have the National Crime Victimization Survey. So when looking at the National Crime Victimization Survey that has been in existence, again, nearly 60 years later, it nationally represents victims, right? It's a nationally representative survey of victims. And it's the primary source of info when looking at frequency, characteristics, and consequences of violence. And it's going to focus on who was victimized and how. Now, generally speaking, with the NCVS, what happens is you have representatives from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They'll come around, they'll do interviews with people, they will send out the survey, they will also encourage people to complete the survey, they'll talk about it, and it's usually about a 2-year study where they are following those individuals over a course of, if I'm not mistaken, every 6 months. You are typically paid for it, so you are getting some compensation for your time, but all it asks is to be honest and be open. Unfortunately, and again, we're not going to go over it in this lecture, but we save it for a different class, particularly victimology, there are some major advantages and disadvantages. The key takeaway I want to give you before I move on is it relies on your memory. How good is your memory? Can you remember stuff that happened to you 6 months ago? Can you remember stuff that happened to you 2 or 3 weeks ago? If your memory is not the best, it would be helpful to write down when something happens. But if you don't do that, the data will be significantly skewed because people may not have the best memory. So, I want to talk about explaining violent and property crime rates and trends. Now, when looking at fatal violence is defined as violence in which a person is killed. Now, as I shared before, you know, it's important to look at these lectures because I will throw bonuses in there to see who's truly looking at the lecture. And while I won't always just be like, yes, bonus, 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 I don't want it to be so obvious, but you will always get the subtle hint. When we look at fatal violence, we get this word called fatality. Now, I'm a props guy. This is Mortal Kombat from the Sega Genesis. We're talking, 1992. So, we're talking a long time ago, 1992. But when this game came out, and I was a very young man, I remember that they introduced something called the fatality. Nobody ever heard of a fatality. Not saying the word didn't exist, fatality absolutely existed in our dictionary. But this game, this revolutionary game, again, look at that, the original game from the Sega Genesis, Mortal Kombat introduced the fatality. And all a fatality was is where you would, you would take out, you would, murder your opponent in the game. No game, no video game had ever done anything like that until Mortal Kombat came out in 1992. And it absolutely changed and revolutionized video game violence. It was very, very, very controversial. With that being said, when we look at gender and race and fatal violence, we know males are murdered at a higher rate. It can be mostly intraracial, but it could be interracial as well. Intraracial meaning that, you might have a person of color murdering someone that is of a different nationality, but it can also be interracial as well. And firearms are very, very common. Now, I want you to ponder this question, okay? Why do you believe that firearms are most frequently used in fatal violence? Ponder this question. There's a lot of videos out there that talks about access to firearms and using firearms in this country. We won't talk about it in this particular lecture, but be sure to take a look at that because the firearm debate is a whole major debate topic that exists in this country. So other types of offenses that are worth noting include aggravated assault. Usually with aggravated assault, it includes some weapon or it's an elevated form of violence against another person. Once again, it may include a weapon. Sometimes it can just be a person, aggressing against another person in such a violent manner that it's beyond the scope of just a battery, and it may cause some significant bodily injury. We also have robbery. Later on, we'll talk about the difference between robbery and burglary, but robbery is the physical action of taking property by force from another person. A person is robbed. Their home is not robbed, but they are robbed. But again, we'll talk about the difference between those two very shortly. Again, going back to gender and race, men are more likely to be victimized by a stranger. Women are more likely to be victimized by someone they know. The data obviously supports that men are more likely to be victimized by a stranger because think about us as men, right? We get into an argument, someone's looking at us wrong, we're in a bar or we're in a sports establishment, we don't like what the person's saying about our team or we're saying something about their team, we get into an argument and we get into a fight. We're not going to have those types of disagreements with people that we know. Women, on the other hand, are absolutely more likely to be victimized by someone they know because the people that's closest to women are the ones who do the most damage and to do the most harm against them. So just a little bit when it comes to, crime against gender. And of course, race does have a small effect as well. But again, we can dive into that in greater detail in other courses as well. So in terms of non-fatal violence, generally speaking, it is committed by unarmed offenders. Whereas when we look at, sexual crimes, it's more likely to involve people who are armed. Robbery will absolutely involve someone who is armed. In fact, when talking about the firearms, generally speaking, the most common weapon that someone will use in a robbery is a firearm. And I would really encourage you to go and look at the firearm topic within this country, because there's a lot of videos out there which discuss it from professional standpoints, people who have studied this for years and years. There's a lot of data and information out there concerning the use of firearms with respect to how people use them during robberies and the commission of robberies. Now, I said this in the last lecture, and I want to come back to it. Property theft, property crime is the most common crime associated in our country, right? While we do have street crimes or violent crimes or personal crimes, so to speak, property crimes are the most common crime perpetuated in our country, because what do we have? We have stuff, we have items, we have valuables, we have belongings, and sometimes people want those things, right? So understand that you're not, yes, violent crime does occur. People are the victims of violent crimes, or what we call the street crimes in the first lecture. However, please know that property theft is the most common form of property crime measured by the National Crime Victimization Survey. More than likely, someone that is listening to me talk in this lecture probably has something stolen from them. Hopefully it's nothing too valuable or too personable, but everyone has probably had something in their life stolen from them. It's a horrible feeling to have a valuable or belonging, especially one with sentimental value, stolen and taken from you. It is. It's heartbreaking and gut-wrenching, to say the least. So I do want to talk about cybercrime, terrorism, and white-collar crime to kind of get ready to put the lid on this lecture. When we look at cybercrime, and we did mention it last week, we see it where it's criminal activities carried out by computers or the internet. Now, cybercrime can involve cyberbullying, cyber harassment. It can involve scams, other types of crime perpetuated against people. But it is a new age digital crime. It's not something that was on the forefront about 20, 25 years ago, right? 20, 25, 30 years ago. It is common today. So, it's important for you, even though this is an intro course, to recognize you got to be careful when you're on the internet, folks. Be very careful. Use a VPN. Don't just put your personal data in. When you get emails that look suspicious, don't just answer it. Don't click on certain links. Again, these are things you all know, but it's very easy for people to fall victim to cybercrime. And my heart goes out to kids today, because sometimes kids don't know, click on something thinking it's too good to be true, and more often than not, it probably is. Now, when we look at terrorism, again, we talk about terrorism being the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. We'll talk about terrorism a little bit more at the end of the semester, so I'm not going to really go into it that much. The only key thing I want to remind you on terrorism is that the tactic that terrorists use, and you will hear this again, is fear. Fear is the number one tactic that they use. But again, we will come back to terrorism at the end of the semester. One thing I will say is that cyber terrorism is important, because what they're doing with cyber terrorism is that they're launching attacks against computers and networks and servers to coerce or intimidate a government. And so with cyber terrorism, could you imagine if cyber terrorists hijacked, let's say, the Social Security Administration, everybody's Social Security numbers, which that did happen. All of our Social Security numbers were leaked. But could you imagine if our Social Security numbers were just absolutely freely flowing out in the dark web, and next thing you know, loans and credit cards and other forms of credit were popping up under your name, and because malicious criminals took your information? I mean, that's cyber terrorism. Or if they hijacked, let's say, the Treasury Department, so this impacted banks and people couldn't withdraw money or use their debit cards. I mean, that's all cyber terrorism. It's very scary, scary stuff. So I want you to look at this image and think about how when you see this image, This is typically what we associate with a terrorist, right? Well, I want you to look at the next image that's about to pop up. And unfortunately, stereotypes can exist. The gentleman that you see right here is Gerber Grewal. He was the former Attorney General of New Jersey. And the Attorney General, and we will cover this again when we get into the courts / law enforcement, but particularly the courts. The Attorney General is considered the state's top law enforcement officer. What's very interesting, class, just a little bit of a history, is the Attorney General is usually an attorney, like they are a lawyer. So even though they're the top law enforcement officer, they consider the top cop. They're not necessarily a law enforcement officer who walking around carrying a gun. They can, but they're also an attorney. And he was the director of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement. Well, Gerber Grewal would often be confused, and he talked about this, as a Muslim or a terrorist. He's not a Muslim, nor is he a terrorist. He is actually of the Sikh religion. So I do want you to take a note of this because it's very easy for people to perpetuate stereotypes on individuals by saying, well, Gerber Grewal, if you didn't know him, you'd think this guy was a terrorist. And yet he's not a terrorist. He operates as one of the top law enforcement officers in New Jersey and has been a champion law enforcement officer for the better part of his career. Sikh religion and people who practice Sikh religion are often confused as Muslims or as terrorists, and it's wrong. And that's just a stereotype that is perpetuated, for no reason other than ignorance and other than not taking the time to recognize, no, this person that's just their religion, So I do want to just tie that into terrorism before we move on. Now, lastly, we talked about white collar crime a little bit in the first lecture. We know white collar crime is generally nonviolent. You don't really ever hear of somebody that commits a white collar crime and they've done, something violent. Now, it's possible that somebody found out that that an individual was money laundering, or they were, doing securities fraud, or they were committing a Ponzi scheme, and maybe they were going to get caught. So then they did decide to take that person out. But it's very rare, very, very rare. Generally speaking, we're talking about the most notorious instances in history of white collar crime, like Enron. Again, this was well before most of your time, but if you need to look up a major white collar crime incident, go look up Enron, Enron. Think about Martha Stewart. There's just a lot of different white collar crime instances out there in our society that you can look up and be like, wow, that really was jarring that person, people lost millions and millions of dollars, or their life saving was gone. But white collar crime, generally speaking, is focused on corruption and money laundering and Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes and security frauds. It generally does not offer any form of violence. And again, credit card fraud is the most reported white collar crime. Please don't, if your credit card is ever stolen or compromised, you need to cancel that credit card immediately. Contact the credit card company so they can send you another card, because credit card fraud is the most reported white collar crime. Now, in terms of the fear and risk of victimization, females are more fearful of being victimized than males. In terms of just individual fear of victimization, especially after 9/11. Now, we've seen things die down some. I mean, we're literally 24 years removed from 9/11. So certainly it's important to know and understand that we may not have the same fear of a terroristic attack, but I can tell you, having lived through 9/11, those first few years, we were on heightened alert. In fact, anytime I watched the news, the United States terrorist threat level was always elevated, meaning that we were at a greater risk of a terrorist attack. We did not get attacked, but we were on high alert. Eventually, that was done away with, certainly by this new generation where we're at, the post 2010, 15, 20 generation. But either way, people's fear is based on whatever they live through. If you lived through a terroristic attack, or if you lived through a school shooting, or you lived through some other violence in a public place, that will impact a person's individual fear. So just keep that in mind. And I will say this. We talked about the media framing on the last lecture. The media still does display a disproportionate amount of violent crime, and sometimes there's a distortion on offenders and victims. Again, the media does a lot of different framing, and I'm not going to go over what those framing were. You can go back and look at that first lecture, but love the media or hate the media, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, the media does play a pivotal role when how crime is viewed. So just bear that and keep that in mind as well. So the last thing, and we're done, is when looking at criminal justice, we do have to pause for a moment and take into consideration theory. Even though theory ties directly into criminology or criminal theories, theory is always tied to data. In fact, data allows us to test the theory. Now, in about 2 slides, we're going to put up some, different types of theories. Again, nothing no one has to know, but understand when looking at a theory, if you don't have data to support the theory, then the theory is not the theory. It's nothing more than a hypothesis or an educated guess. So you have to test the theory. It has to be quantifiable and it has to be testable. The theory is absolutely fundamental in understanding criminal justice. Without theory, criminal justice does not fully operate, even though the criminal justice system is the components and the institutions involved in enforcing our laws and defending our laws and upholding our laws. But understand that when it comes to theory, theory is a fundamental logic within understanding the criminal justice system. So we have theories. They're biological, they're psychological, and they're sociological. When we look at biological, you think about like neurological abnormalities, how people, where they, if they suffered from poor education, maybe nurture, maybe nature. When we certainly look at psychology or psychological research, they will, for example, say that, okay, life sentences without parole is unconstitutional. Certainly when it comes to juvenile offenders, it's unconstitutional to give a juvenile offender life without parole. And then, of course, when we look at the sociology, what is the role in society? How does environments play a role? What about, people's thoughts and how they're raised and the social forces around them, whether it's the their environment, whether it's social forces such as their friends or mentors or their parents or their upbringing, but sociology plays a role too. And so again, this is just some of the theories. Again, we don't go over it in this class. That's a whole different class. So I just want to put it up here for a moment for anyone to just look at and then see what the premise of the theory is. And then, of course, what the brief description is. So again, not anything that is really deeply discussed so much in this course. However, it is important to know that theory does play a pivotal and key role in criminal justice and one's understanding of the criminal justice system. So we're at the conclusion. As I stated, I will always put a chapter wrap up in. I will always try to give you one key nugget to take away from. And I guess the key nugget that I want to give you is data. Okay. When it comes to measuring crime, we measure crime through data. And how do we measure crime through data? Well, we have 2 key sources. We have law enforcement reports and we have surveys. When it comes to law enforcement reports, we get that data through police records, police reports. They go to the Uniform Crime Reports, which goes to the FBI. We have the supplementary homicide reports, the SHR. We have the National Incident-Based Reporting System. But we have official data. That's one. If we don't have official data because people don't want to report crimes, they don't want to call the police, then we get them through the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS. And all that is just talking to people, asking them about their victimization. How did it impact them? What happened to them? Be honest and be open. So as always, in every lecture, I want to give you one key nugget to please focus on. Recognize that to measure crime, we get it through data. And how do we get it through data? We either get it through official data, law enforcement reports, or we get it through surveys, people self-reporting and talking about their victimization. So I want to thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned as we'll jump into chapter 3 next time. Take care, be safe, and I'll see you next time.